Thank you, Sarah. Got it. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Ms. Fowler and Mr. Knoth. Each candidate will have 5 minutes for opening statements to introduce themselves and tell us why they're running for the First Ward City Columbia Council seat. After that, we'll take questions from the audience, including Muleskinner members and guests, such as media representatives. So start thinking of your questions. For those asking questions, please take no more than 30 seconds to ask your question. Remember, most of the time we want to hear from the candidates, not from the questioners. So keep your questions concise, if you will. Each candidate will be allowed to speak for 2 minutes on each question. For each question, the questions will alternate who gets to reply first. Following the questions, each candidate will have 5 minutes for closing statements to summarize their positions. Any questions from anyone on the format? Now, this is my first time serving as moderator. Our person who normally serves as a moderator couldn't be here today, so hopefully I'll get it half as smooth as she does. All right, let's start. As Ms. Fowler is the incumbent, I'll let you go first. So you have 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone, and it's nice to see so many names. Like many of you, I've missed a lot of us during the COVID years when we had to keep our distance. First, I want to ask you to call me Pat. I went from being Pat for all the years that I spent time with the Muleskinners and with city government and city boards and commissions to being Miss Fowler, and it's a transition I have not made comfortably. So again, please always call me Pat. Unless you want me to call you Mr. or Mrs., and then I'm happy to oblige as well. So let me talk about why it's important for me to be elected to a second term on city council. It has been 20 years since I started attending city meetings and watching how decisions are made inside City Hall. I learned how they affected my neighborhood when my neighborhood was on the city's fringe. The first house I bought was literally 2 blocks away from the city's boundary. And then I have watched how those decisions have been made when I live in a downtown older neighborhood just adjacent to Jefferson Middle School. So in watching those processes, I've incrementally learned how these decisions are made, and they are not made in favor of the First Ward. And as a First Ward resident, I've been listening first to my immediate neighbors in the North Central Neighborhood Association, and then to our neighbors in the adjoining neighborhood associations as we tried to align ourselves together to get City Hall to pay attention to us. We have a lot of work to do regarding equity, where small property owners have the same rights as larger property owners who are adjacent to us. We have a long way to go in achieving racial equity in our town, something that continues to elude us because it's too uncomfortable a conversation to have. When I became the First Ward representative, many people said to me, "We appreciate how you do your homework. We appreciate how you stand for issues, and we expect you to hold on to that all the way through how you vote." And when I have made a mistake and not voted the way that I said and argued for, I heard from them immediately. And then I'll give you an example of that. I voted to change the ordinance for the Citizens Police Review Board after arguing for as long as I could not to do that. That was a mistake on my part, which I then spoke to my constituents about and let them know that I would not make that mistake again. When COVID started, our mayor at the time told us that the pandemic would expose every inequity in our community. And I believed him and I paid attention. And I see some of that inequity more clearly. And I work to be trustworthy enough for the folks that see it even more clearly than me to bring that information to me and help us make better decisions. So, running for a second term is about continuing to address that inequity that was exposed by the pandemic. And it's also about how we're going to spend that $25 million that the federal government gave us. So I'm grateful for this time with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you, Pat. Give me a second here to stop all my timers. I'm still working with time. I forgot to mention at the beginning, and I'll rectify that now. I did print up
Oh.
signs. I will try to 30 seconds. I think you have a 10 seconds left and then a stop. And what I think I will do is when my kitchen timer goes off telling me, okay, it's been 5 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever the thing is, I'll probably just unmute myself so y'all can hear the kitchen timer. So at this point, let me clear this before I have Nick start. Yep, I haven't played with the kitchen timer for a while. Obviously, I don't spend as much time, enough time in the kitchen, right, Carol? All right, let's say 5, 2, 4, 30. So I need a few more kitchen timers.
You need one that's easier to set, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. And 10, 20. Okay, I think I about got there. All right, Nick, you go right ahead, sir.
Thank you. I want to start off first of all by saying I've been sick this whole week and I still am, so please give me grace as I answer some of your questions. I'm originally from the St. Louis area, where I was born and raised by a single mother as the youngest of 3 children. From my childhood, I know what it's like to be evicted, to face food insecurity, and to not know how you're going to make it through tomorrow, let alone the cold without heat. Through the fortune of a public education made up of teachers who believed in me, and even went so far as to pay my college application fees, I graduated high school and came to Mizzou, where I earned my degrees as a first-generation college graduate. Like many, after college, I fell in love and never left. I now work as a regional director for a national nonprofit, but outside of that, I have the honor of serving on the board of directors for the Boys and Girls Club of Columbia. In addition to that, I have had the privilege of serving on a half dozen local commissions and boards, including the Housing and Community Development Commission, the Board of Representatives for the Family Access Center of Excellence, or FACE, and the Bicycle and Pedestrian Commission. My immediate family includes my wife, Taylor, a public health nurse and fellow MU alum, and we live on Oak Street with our sweet dog, Sam. I'm running to represent the First Ward because as a resident, I see that the needs of my neighbors are often overlooked. And when these issues do manage to rise to the top, it just doesn't seem like there is a path being presented that will allow everyone to really come together and act on behalf of the First Ward. I believe that progress requires more than finger pointing, and that highlighting a problem is only the first step to solving it. Taking responsibility and ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table, even when we disagree, is key to addressing Columbia's diverse needs and bringing actual improvements to the First Ward and our community at large. There is no shortage of issues that need to be addressed, but the top issues I'm hearing about from those in the First Ward when knocking doors will also be my top priorities. These include ensuring equitable access to services and opportunities. And I can tell you that as somebody who grew up impoverished, I know that just because a service exists does not mean it is accessible to those who need it. Improving our sidewalks and the safety of bicyclists and pedestrians must be a priority. Making investments in critical sewer and wastewater projects to protect the longevity of our historic First Ward neighborhoods, the environment, and our livability of our homes is important. Expanding and evolving the resources available to the unsheltered and others at risk must also be a priority. And I'll end in priorities with saying that we must address the affordable housing shortfall in our community, which is acutely apparent in the First Ward, where many rely on for the most affordable housing in Columbia. Ultimately, the challenges facing our ward, our neighborhoods, and our community at large are complicated. And we're never going to make progress if we cannot work together across ideological and socioeconomic divides. I know that together, neighbor to neighbor, the First Ward can do great things. And that's why I'm running. This is my home. I love Columbia. I love the First Ward. It's where my wife and I hope to raise a family here soon. And again, my name's Nick. I'm running for the First Ward Council seat, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nick. Now you have to stop all these. Maybe All right. We're looking for questions now from people. I got them cleared. No, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. All right. If you have questions for the candidates, again, this is from the audience, anyone in the audience. If you're a Muleskinner member, regular attender, you only stop by once a year, or if you're a guest and this is your first time here, especially members of the media, you're all welcome to ask questions. Feel free, if you want to use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. That will pop you up so I'll see you easily there. Or if you prefer to put a question in the chat, I can present it to the candidates. I'm looking now. Some people don't have an access to the reactions button, so they just raise their hand. I'm looking for hands and not seeing any questions. Oh, where are our regular? There we go. David Lethal. Lethal, please go ahead.
There, I needed to unmute myself. My question is on affordable housing. What, if anything, can the city council do with regard to affordable housing? It's a problem we've had for some time, and I think the problem is not being solved. And I take it that the city council really doesn't have an effective, doesn't have the authority for an effective program. But what can be done about affordable housing in Columbia, if anything?
All right, let's start with Nick. We'll try to alternate between since she went first last time. Nick.
Yeah, David, thank you for that question, and I'm glad it was asked. I had no doubt it would be. Affordable housing, I think, is perhaps at least competing for the single largest issue in our community. Because as somebody who faced housing insecurity, and I've told folks that I moved over 20 times before I was in high school, and that was either from eviction or from trying to evade eviction, and not always successfully. People in our community cannot focus on their kids, on getting a good job, if they have to worry about having a roof over their head in the first place. And so as for what the city can do, there's a lot, and the city has already done a fair amount. We've supported the Community Land Trust, which does good work, and there's no shortage of nonprofits. But the city cannot in any way address and ultimately solve, so to speak, this issue alone. It is a perfect example of something that must be addressed in a public-private partnership, because at the end of the day, the answer to the affordable housing shortfall is more housing. And you need, whether that is people, private builders building it, the Land Trust building, Job Point building, the Habitat for Humanity building. It's going to take every single organization who is impacted by this, including, in my opinion, private employers who can step up and help this cause that have nothing to do with building homes, to ensure that we have a robust housing marketplace. And some of the small and more technical things that council can do, as I'm sure many here have heard discussed, is there's always going to be planning and zoning issues that could be addressed. The first ward is filled with unique lots that are not traditional in their size or shape or boundaries, and things can be made easier, so to speak, so that we can have infill. There's no shortage of empty lots. I know I have 6 within 1 block of my home, and that is often the case around the first ward. So there's a lot that can be done, but my main point that I want to be sure to make is that there's a lot of partners that need to be at the table in addressing this challenge.
David, you're muted.
I used to do this a lot, and now I'm messed up. Okay, Kat, two minutes, please.
Well, I see 3 things the city can do. So all of the things that Nick talked about with people outside of city government are important too. The 3 things the city can do is, first of all, acknowledge that we have a high number of vacant properties in the first ward. And when planning and zoning representatives came to talk to us about a month ago about short-term rentals, they had a chart that showed we had 1,100 properties that were unoccupied. So the first thing the city can do is identify those properties and figure out, make contact with those owners, figure out why those properties are vacant. The next thing we can do, and we can do this because we own all of our own utilities, we can look long and hard at the energy efficiency of the rental property that we have in the first ward. Because what makes a housing affordable is not only your base rent, it's what you have to pay in utilities, and it's what you have to pay in transportation to get all the places you need to go for your family, whether it's getting your kids to school and you to work and to the doctor's office and all those other things. So the city can address the empty units, it can address the energy efficiency of the units, and then it can address the fact that we have small lots that have been traditionally individual homes going back to the 1920s. And rather than determine that they are non-conforming or illegal, we could recognize the importance of those small lots and acknowledge those as legal lots.
Very good. That's into that. Thank you very much, both of y'all. I have a question in chat from Anthony Wilfroth. He says, Nick says there's too much finger pointing on city council without a path forward. To him, to Anthony, what's labeled as finger pointing is often simply council members having conversations on behalf of constituents and stakeholders that haven't adequately happened beforehand. His question is, if those conversations aren't appropriate for city council meetings, when are they supposed to happen? We'll alternate back, so I'll let, even though it was addressed to something Nick said, I'll let Pat answer that first. And then
thank you. Thanks for the question. So it raises a really important point, because if you watch city council as an observer, what you see is an item gets called to be talked about. Then the staff gives us a report that we really don't get much opportunity to ask questions about because of the time constraints. Then we get to ask a couple of questions. We don't get very many minutes. I certainly don't get 5 minutes to ask questions at that point. And then we open it up for public hearing and we let people come up and tell us what they think, but we don't engage with them in conversation. So they leave largely unsatisfied. And this is actually a change. We used to engage in conversation with folks at the podium. And I know because I was there for 17 years engaging with council from the podium. So we don't, then when we're done with that, then we're supposed to take all that information and in a very short period of time, sort that through our filters of what we know about a topic, going back as many years as we can tie those pieces together, and then we have to make a decision. So you're right, trying to get the information you need in the short amount of time. And again, in many instances, that's the mayor deciding how long a matter can go on for, much to the dismay of those folks sitting in the audience. We have to figure out exactly what's important and understand why it's important to the people that live adjacent to that, and then make our decision when we vote. All of that leaves a lot of things unsaid and unaddressed.
all right, thank you, Pat. Nick, I'll let you have 2 minutes for that.
Yeah, just reading Anthony's question to make sure I understand. So his question of, if those conversations are not appropriate for city council meetings. Well, first of all, I would say they are appropriate for city council meetings. To me, what is, it's a matter of being effective, right? There's a lot of work to be done that should be done between council meetings. And that requires being present and being here to meet with city management, other city council members, since at the end of the day, you are one of 7 and you need 4 votes to make anything happen. So I would say perfectly appropriate for conversations on behalf of constituents and stakeholders to occur. That was not the point I was trying to make, but I appreciate the question.
Right, thank you. I'm looking for other questions now. I see one in the chat, but that's to me. So I know, Winnie, I don't know how to increase the volume of my mic, but I'll speak more clearly to the mic. Hopefully that will work. I'm looking for other questions from the audience for Scott. Scott Crystal has put something out there. What issue do you feel the most passionate about? Is it the same as people of the first ward? And if not, what is their priority? Ooh, that's a little tricky one. Let's see, we started with Pat last time. Let's go with Nick. Nick, you get to answer this one in 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, so for me, the issue that I am most passionate about in the first ward, and again, this is me personally, not what I think perhaps is the most important issue in the first ward, is affordable housing. Or rather, I want to stop using the word affordable and just really talk about housing, because there's workforce housing, there's family housing, you can put a lot of modifiers on it, but housing as a whole is something I'm very passionate about, again, both given my personal experience and seeing that the first ward has often been a kind of a safe haven of affordable housing and keeping it that way. But to the second part of that question, and is it the same as people of the first ward? And if not, what is their priority? So I've already knocked a couple hundred doors myself, and I can tell you that nobody has the same priority. It depends on who you talk to. There are folks who their priority is literally what's in their backyard. Sometimes it's often not what makes the paper, right? I've had very few folks discuss roll carts with me at the door. That's not keeping them up at night. But things like housing and infrastructure and equity are major things, and each of those is very wide ranging. I mean, when we talk about infrastructure, it's everything from sewer and wastewater to broadband and everything that makes our city hum and is important. And so I would leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Nick. Pat, I'll let you answer that 2 minutes, please.
So yes, there's a lot of differing opinions, but all of them funnel into equity. And do we have racial equity in our city? Do we have economic equity in our city? And we know that equity is not equal. It's about acknowledging where we've left people behind and we help them catch up. So whether we're talking about housing, that's an issue about equity. Whether we're talking about small footprint houses that don't want to be displaced by a large out of scale building next to them, that's about equity. If we're talking about resources for families because their kids are falling behind in school, and as you all know, the school district is dealing with the loss of learning during COVID for our families that had fewer resources. And so that translates into equity in our community as well. Did we have equity for moms and dads who worked through COVID? Were they able to pay their bills on time, or did they fall further behind? All of these things are the core of whether or not the first ward prospers at the same rate as other parts of the community. And when I talk about who should prosper at the same rate, I always look at the lowest paid of the lowest paid among us, because we know the city as a significant employer has so far been unable and unwilling to pay a living wage to a lot of their employees. I used to work at the university, so I understand there's a large swath of university folks that are also paid less than they need to support their families. So really, you can go in almost any direction, but you have to look at equity, especially where it comes to over policing in the first ward and also in the third ward.
All right, thank you, Pat. We've got a couple of other questions that have come up. Let me look at Scott Crystal asks, what issue do you feel the most passionate about? Is it the same? Wait, no, I'm sorry. That was Scott. We already asked that one. Kathy Jensen asked, what are some of the inequities you have identified in the first ward, and how would you propose addressing them? We'll go back to Pat first.
So I see there's something going in the chat about ARPA funds, because really what this election is about, from my perspective, is how we're going to spend our ARPA funds and who gets to vote on that. So I introduced a resolution with Ian Thomas about a year ago, specifying that we would spend all of our ARPA funds on persons we have traditionally left behind. So folks, racial inequity, families that have experienced trauma in our community, folks that have been under-resourced despite all the prosperity around us, and those folks who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. To me, the most important thing we need to do now is dig deep as to where we put those ARPA dollars, because we have an opportunity to attend to those disproportionate impacts. We have an opportunity to attend to what Mayor Treese said, which is every inequity in our community would be exposed. And I think we're required to address those things with that funding.
All right, thank you. And Nick, same question.
So am I answering the inequities question or am I skipping to the ARPA question?
Oh, well, inequities, she chose to address that. That's,
But will I then get to talk about ARPA later?
I think if that's is that a question that's coming up later?
Yeah, it was.
If so, then yes.
Okay. So to the question of what are some of the inequities you have identified in the first ward, it's really the things we've been touching on. Everything from housing to workforce to the infrastructure. I mean, the first ward's often been kind of been treated as the stepchild in terms of given the leftovers or not been prioritized. There are things that occur or don't occur in the first ward that wouldn't never happen in another ward in our city, especially when it comes to the lack of improvements and maintenance of certain infrastructure. One thing that I think is interesting is, the first ward is really a microcosm of our city as a whole in terms of, we have socioeconomically speaking, we have upper class, we have middle class, and we have lower class. And that is a great thing to see, but it really displays those inequities even within the first ward, because Broadway is very different from Worley, and Worley is very different from the north central neighborhoods around where Pat lives. And so it's across the board in terms of how do you propose addressing them. Again, for me, it goes back to starting with, for everything, you have to start with having everybody at the table who it impacts and who can help move the issue. And that's even when we disagree. That's important. You can't just be people who agree with what you think or who you like. We need everyone at the table.
All right, thank you. Pat? I think, did I go back to the same question? So, have you already answered that?
I answered the question about inequities and what's important. And I also tied it into ARPA because I think this election is about ARPA.
Okay, very good. I'm sorry about that.
I think that's why there is so much concern about who wins with seats.
All right, let's go on to the next question. Peter Schneeberger asked, do you agree that 100% of Columbia's electric supply should be renewable by 2030? And we'll start with Pat there and go. Wait, we started with Pat last time, right? This will be Nick's turn. All right, Nick.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is a very fair goal. And I would expand on that by saying, we have a climate adaptation and action plan that I believe the city needs to really recommit to and double down on. I think we've, in some areas, let's say, slacked off on really living up to our own expectations and standards and truly what is going to be the best for our community in the long term.
All right, thank you. And Pat.
So it's been at least 5 years since the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan came to City Council. I wasn't on council then, but I remember reading it several times for the forums that we had 3 years ago. And at that time, I was totally on board with we should be 100% renewable by 2030. Now, 5 years in, is it still possible if we had a proactive timeline to get there by 2030? Because it seems what the city keeps doing is we're dragging our feet, we're thinking about it, we're dragging our feet, and we'll get closer and closer, and then that deadline won't be realistic anymore. But there's something really exciting happening, and I hope I have time to get this in before the 2 minutes are up. So we have a City Vision Commission that has been looking and trying to understand what its job is. And then it said, wait a minute, our job is to align the spending of the city, especially the ARPA funds, with our strategic plan and our climate action plan. And they are putting together recommendations about that because they want to work with the city and they want to work with boards and commissions and they want to work with neighborhoods on it. And I think that's really exciting because we'll have that tangible step that will make all of this understandable to us. Right now, it's sort of, there's some mystery going on in the background about how we take these incremental steps to get this done. And they're going to work on making sure that more of us understand that and more of us can follow along with it. And that's a wonderful development and one that I hope that we will enthusiastically support and encourage.
Thank you. And Nick already went on. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. I'm scrolling through chat and look real quick, see if anyone has any hands up. Not seeing any right now. All right, I think there's some more stuff in chat. What is the city? All right, Alice Turner's, what is the city current policies fit rental housing? Also tying energy efficiency to more frequent rental inspections. Has that been enacted? I'm not sure what the question is there, but we'll let Pat take a stab at it and then Nick.
This is one of my profound disappointments with the way in which we operate the Office of Neighborhood Services. They are all good people. I remember how much time I got to spend with them when I was a neighborhood association leader. And sadly, once you become an elected official, there's a wall between you and city staff. You get to talk to them during public meetings, or if the city manager invites them to a meeting that you have with them. So regarding that is, we're not doing enough. We only have an inspection system that inspects properties every 6 years. We only charge enough for the maintenance or the review and the oversight of rental properties to enable us to have an inspection system that only inspects every 6 years. And that property maintenance code is not very diligent or it doesn't go very deeply into what you and I would consider a house in good repair. So we have to do all of those things, because if you want to talk about affordable housing, you also have to talk about the cost of utilities, and you also have to talk about all the consequences a family has when they live in a property that is not in good repair. So I will once again go back in and talk to the city manager about that. And I will encourage all of us to get behind the programs that both the Climate and Environment Commission have brought to our attention, and the programs that that organizations have been talking about. You all know Carolyn Amperin. She's brought us several ideas. That means we should start there and start working on that with the Water and Light Board and with the Finance and Audit Committee. Thank you.
So energy efficiency and the program we have at the city is incredibly important. For those who don't know, or just for a reminder for those who may have forgotten, we have an energy efficiency program that allows residents to pretty much get rebates for things like adding insulation to their homes, new windows, things that increase the energy efficiency of your home. I think that is an incredible program, and in full transparency, I've utilized it. That's how when my wife and I bought our home here in the First Ward, like a lot of the older homes, we needed to add insulation, and it was a wonderful program. That being said, it is not without its barriers. It is something that I think those on a lower income who would benefit the most from this program would have a hard time utilizing. This goes back to my point of equitable access in terms of we need to lower barriers to programs. The city has a lot of great programming, such as the energy efficiency programs, but we need to lower the barriers so that, again, those who need it the most, those who would be have the best positive impact from utilizing that service can actually use it.
All right, thank you. I want to scroll on down now. This is one I think we talked on ARPA a couple of times, but specifically Pam Cooper raised the question, and we'll get down to that specifically. So you both have a couple more minutes to talk about it. She said, I'd like the candidates to discuss their views regarding the city's decision to make the ARPA funding applications closed. non-publicly accessible, a closed, non-publicly accessible process, and also discuss what they think are the most important priorities for how ARPA funds are spent. And for the latter question, please discuss citywide needs as well as first ward needs. So Nick, I'll let you go first.
Yes, so great question. I appreciate Pam Cooper asking this. I will say I am not at all happy with the closed loop that exists in terms of how the city is handling funding applications for ARPA. I think it should be much more transparent. Just like you can go on the city's website and look at budgets and look at departments and projects, it should be the same way with the ARPA requests. There should be nothing that's hidden about this. There's no need for it to be hidden. These are not the same as competitive bid requests that perhaps industries don't want to disclose some type of trade advantage. This is not that. This is public money that we have one opportunity to use, and the public should have absolute access to the information, to the process, and we do not have that right now. And that is very discouraging and very disheartening. As for how the ARPA funds are spent, my thought on it is that going back to the fact that this is one-time money, God willing, right? We don't want another pandemic where we get another boatload of money from the federal government for some unforeseen reason. But this is one-time money, which means to me that we need to invest it in something, in a variety of things, in different initiatives that are going to make long-term impacts in our community, not one-off things, not something that, as much as I love the idea, again, as somebody who grew up poor, of doing maybe a round of stimulus checks to the most disadvantaged in our community, that is one-off, and that is not going to fundamentally change the environment for those who are struggling in our community. Investing in things like lowering the barriers to workforce development, ensuring adequate access to broadband, supporting the projects being put together by our nonprofits that address mental health and the homeless community and the unsheltered. Those are things that can make a long-term positive impact that will far outlast any of us and any of our time on council or anything. That should be the goal, and that would be my priority if elected.
All right, thank you, Nick. And Pat, you have 2 minutes.
So I want to start by introducing the idea of how we distribute federal money. You know that we get a certain amount from HUD for community development block grants and home funds. So the city, and we get money that comes through the human services, which is also grant funding. We don't put any of our money into that before we got to ARPA. But what we've been doing for years is we said to not-for-profit organizations, hey, if we gave you some money, how much do you want and what would you spend it on? We don't connect it to the needs of our community. We run a survey, but we don't really connect what the survey says. And we ask very general questions that's hard to get specifics from the survey. So in that context, we move into ARPA. And I was so excited when I heard that they had drafted an RFP for several things that I asked to read the RFP. And they said, no, you couldn't possibly do that. That's under contract negotiation. So I got on the phone and I called the National League of Cities. And then I called the Missouri Municipal League and I talked to their legislative analysts and I said, what's going on here? Is there a reason why they can have these processes closed? And he said, no, it's a local political decision. And I said, do you know of any other communities that you've worked with that have a closed process? And they said, no. And so I went back and I said to the city manager more than once and to the mayor, wait a minute, why are you putting something between us and reading these proposals? Because just as Nick says, when it comes down to it, this is our one best chance to attend to years of neglect. And instead of doing that in a way that builds trust with our citizens, we sadly are perpetuating the same mistrust. And one of the reasons why this is so important is if you've watched the funding processes over the years, the money goes to white-led businesses, white-led not-for-profits. And here we have an opportunity and an emerging group of Black leaders that would like to be at the table, that would like to share with us their data and would like to be eligible for those funds. And we won't know whether that's happening or not until it ends up on council agenda and we're asked to vote on it. Not okay.
All right, thank you. We are getting close to the time where each of the candidates will have 5 minutes wrap up. So I'm going to, even though we've got several other questions out there, I'm going to skip a couple from people who've already asked questions in, so I can ask someone, read a question for someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Sarah Catlin says, both candidates have mentioned the importance of the city partnering with other entities. And the fact is that it takes 4 city council members in agreement to move issues forward. Please speak to how you have demonstrated the ability to work with others in order to come to consensus and move forward with solutions. We'll start with you, Pat.
So let's talk about the Fusus software, because I think it's the most recent example of how I've worked with others. I brought to the city manager's attention my concerns about how we were going about determining what kind of policies would govern the use of the Fusus software. I think you all know what it is, so I don't need to explain that to you. And I shared with him, and so did Roy Lovelady, our concerns from our Black and brown neighbors about how they view the implementation of that software. We weren't getting anywhere with the city manager. So we did our work together, and an overwhelming number of community members came forward to the public hearing when it finally got to a public hearing and expressed their concerns and demanded a policy first. So that's how it works in City Hall. The idea that somehow we have all these times to meet, which we don't, by the way, sunshine prevents us from meeting in between meetings. The idea that we somehow work these things out in a consensus basis is not how it works. It works when the public, who is directly impacted by the decisions we make, come into council chambers and tell us why it's a good or a bad idea. And I listen and I carry their concerns forward. And as I told you at the beginning, I then vote the same way I argue. So I don't, after saying, no, we can't do it this way, I don't vote with the majority, or I don't vote to do it anyway. I hold that conviction, that decision all the way through in how I vote. And that's what you get if I come back for a second term. There's nothing mysterious about how I represent our city. I ask people for their help. I try and widen the lane so they can come in and be part of the process until we can get to a place where we change the process, that we can have more input ahead of time and we can have dialogue ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nick.
Yeah, so as to how I can demonstrate the ability to work with others to build consensus. Now, I'm in a fortunate position where I have done this in a professional capacity. I've been in positions where I've built coalitions to address issues ranging from infrastructure and public safety to housing. And I'm fortunate that I have strong working relationships already with all members of our city council, including Pat. Pat and I have worked together, and I have no doubt that at the conclusion of this election, whichever way it goes, that we would continue working together because that is what I do. I work with anyone and everyone, even when we have disagreements, because I believe firmly that that is how we should be operating. That perhaps the biggest demonstration I can provide in that regard is just the Roachport Bridge project that is currently being built and will soon be finished, or soon being, I think, 2025. Is something that I had the pleasure of forming and leading that I-70 task force that came together across 9 municipalities, almost as many mayors and council members and public works directors and county commissioners to secure both state and federal funding. I take great pride in working across all lines because to me, at the end of the day, any progress is better than no progress. You're not always going to get everything you want. That's just not how it works. At any level of government, it requires compromise and incremental improvement is often the result of government. Would I like to see large strides and giant steps forward on things? Absolutely. And maybe some of those will happen. But most of the time it comes down to compromising with your fellow council members, with city staff and community leaders to accept that some type of improvement is better than no improvement at all.
Right. Thank you. I think there's several questions, hands raised, and other questions out there. I'm glad to see this topic, this forum has generated questions. Unfortunately, we're down to the point we give each of the candidates 5 minutes to wrap up. We're going to have to cease our questioning now, but I would suggest that each of the candidates put in the chat or mention in their closing comments some way for these people to contact you directly so they can get the answers to their questions they like. So think about that. And with that, we'll go into the closing 5 minutes, and we started with Pat. So Nick, we'll give you 5 minutes to wrap up.
Well, I'll say I don't have 5 minutes worth of closing. But I do want to say a few things. Primarily, there is no one policy issue as to why I'm running. It's rather that I believe that, like we have seen in other wards in our city, and now it is the first ward, that it is time for change. I have nothing but the greatest respect for Pat, and I admire her passion and believe she has done great work in bringing attention to issues that her and I are fundamentally and largely in agreement on. But I think that our representation needs to adapt to the community that it is representing, and move forward and make progress and take responsibility when we fail to do so. I don't think I am the best candidate to ever run for city council. And what I've told folks when I'm running and when I'm knocking on the doors of people is that my campaign and why I'm running and what I'm doing, this is not about me. This is about the first ward. And if I'm elected, there will be times where I take votes believing this is what's best for the first ward, and maybe I disagree with it. But that's representation. That is advocating for your community, for your ward, for your neighborhoods, and for people who don't have that voice, like myself as a young kid, or my mother who was raising 3 kids and trying to avoid eviction. I think when it comes to the socioeconomic challenges facing First Ward and the very diverse people within it, that nobody's going to advocate better for the underprivileged than somebody who has been underprivileged. And it's near and dear to me. It is the foundation of who I am. Government clothed me, it fed me, it put a roof over my head, and it put me through school. And I have a profound belief in the good and an understanding of the bad that government can do, and the hope for what it can be. And that is why I'm running for our First Ward City Council seat. Again, my name is Nick Kanoth. I'm running for the First Ward seat, and I really appreciate this invitation.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Pat, I'll let you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate having this time with you. And I'm seeing so many names of people I haven't seen since the last Muleskinner forum we had 3 years ago at Hy-Vee. So I want to give an example of why it's important to continue to listen to the folks that otherwise aren't heard. So I keep office hours most Saturdays in City Hall. Sometimes I have them both Saturday and Sunday so people can come in and talk to me. And I have, through these past 3 years, earned the trust of many of our First Ward residents who know that even if we don't succeed in the vote that is going to happen at the next council meeting, that they are comforted to know that we're making progress and we're going to keep working at it. And an example of that is some of the policies the city has around utilities and the payment of utilities. That causes active harm to our low-income families. They arbitrarily set a date when your utility bill is due. If you can't make it, they then send you a shutoff notice and they charge you a late fee. So it took far too many months for us to even make incremental progress on that with city staff. And that was just the first layer. We have 4 or 5 other layers of where we're doing harm to our low-income families with how we charge for our utilities and how we bill for our utilities. But I wouldn't know that if I hadn't been willing to listen to whatever anyone wanted to tell me. And I put in the chat box my cell phone number. One of the things that I've been blessed with is that people take me seriously when I say, if you have any information you want me to know, just text it to me and I'll call you. Because if I don't have enough good information about how our decisions affect them and their families, I'm not making good decisions on their behalf. So I make myself available. You know that I work a full-time job, so I do have to have those that loyalty to my employer during the work week. But I make myself available as much as I can on Saturday and Sunday and on council Mondays, so that people can always find me and talk with me. And again, I give my cell phone number out freely to everyone and say, if you have any information that you want me to know, please text it to me and ask me for some time so we can talk. So I want to continue to represent the First Ward because there are so many decisions that City Hall makes every single day without taking into consideration the residents of the First Ward and the residents across the city who are struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to help their families, or they're struggling under the weight of being over-policed by the Columbia Police Department. We've not touched on that today. And that is one of the most significant issues facing our community. It faces more directly our Black and Brown neighbors, but it faces all of us when we live under a system of training where we hold certain people's value in our community differently than the majority culture. And I hope again that we have one of our forums where we can talk about policing and that effect it has on our families. I thank you for your time today. I thank you for the interest that you take in civic topics. Probably 10 or 15 years ago, I used to tape for CAT TV, the programming that you put out and the guest speakers, so that more people could appreciate some of the civic conversations that you all generated. Thank you for your time today.
All right, thank both of you. We do have a few minutes left. I may have stopped a little bit early. So let me go back. We've got a couple questions still back in the chat that we didn't cover. Let me hit those real quick. Susan Mays says she's lived in Columbia for almost 40 years, 30 of that in the First Ward. And the sewer and stormwater infrastructure in the First Ward was a topic in every single council election. Next to no progress has been made. After council people are elected, they've often stopped talking about it, mostly because it's an expensive problem that doesn't bring more money into the city. What is the way to force the city to do the work, or at least stop the city's policies at worst? I'm not sure. It's back to 1240 if you want to look at that. If y'all don't mind taking another couple minutes, let's.
Oh, yeah, I'm ready.
As long as we're here, we don't want to short to anyone. And yeah, Pat, go ahead. I'll let you go 2 minutes.
So one of the interesting things about stormwater and sewer, and Susan knows this because I know where Susan lives and I know some of the difficulties that she's experienced with the city. The first thing that happens is the city tells you it's not their fault. So you have either water, dirty water, or sewage water backing up in your basement, and you call the city. Now, I'm not talking about those nice folks that work at the Grissom building because they're awesome when you call them in the middle of the night. But I'm talking about the folks in City Hall. The first thing they say to you is, we don't know anything about this problem. It's never happened before and it can't be our fault. Well, then you then get determined to find out, and you go down to City Hall and you wait them out until you get all the data about your street and that region and that basin that you're on. And you find out the city has known about this for years. So the first thing we need to do is be honest. Now, I'm not a city staff person. I can't go into their data systems and kick out all the information that our folks are looking for. But I can be a clear voice to our city manager and to the other city council members that we have to be honest about what we already know about our failing sewer and stormwater systems. And then we have to make a plan. And it used to be that we would walk around and say, okay, well, what is the total unmet need in this, what they call deferred maintenance? And we have some data, but we don't have enough because the city doesn't feel it's important enough to share that information with neighborhoods. We as neighborhoods have worked at organizing ourselves. In fact, there is a organization of all the neighborhoods together where we came together to try and get more information and find more projects we could work on together. And I think that's a great idea as a former neighborhood association leader, that there's that opportunity. But Susan is right. And Susan was right when she spent all that time trying to discover exactly what the city already knew about her sewer and stormwater problems.
All right, thank you. Nick, would you like to take 2 minutes for that?
Yeah, so infrastructure is a huge issue in the First Ward, whether it's sewer and wastewater, as Susan pointed out, or electric and broadband and sidewalks and whatever it may be. And a lot of it is due to a lack of commitment from not only the city in terms of our city management and the lack of information perhaps, but also a history to some extent of our council doing what is politically more prudent than what is actually good government and good policy of improving our community. There's certainly notable examples of that, but we need council members and a council as a whole who are committed to taking action and to bring 4 votes together at minimum to actually make things happen. Because at the end of the day, if council takes a vote and makes something happen, the city staff have to follow it. But it's often been a lack of either political willpower or an inability to build a consensus among the council on what should be the first step, what should be the next step even. And again, this goes back to my point of any progress is better than no progress. And on infrastructure issues in the first ward, what we have a lot outside of standard things that happen through the CIP process and things of that nature is no progress. And that is just unacceptable.
All right. I've got about 3 minutes till one. Kathy Jensen I'm sorry. Sarah, as president, I don't know, would you like me to go ahead and wrap it up now, or do you have time? You think we have time for another question?
I've got 1 minute till. I think we've probably been grilling them long enough. We can go ahead and wrap up.
All right. I didn't want to hang over too long. So,
Sure.
all right. I want to thank both of our candidates. Let's give them applause and thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much. So now
Thank you all.
return control of the meeting back over to Sarah then. Thank you.
Pardon me. Yeah, thank you to Pat and to Nick for taking the time to speak with us today. Again, at the beginning of the chat and at the end of the chat, Dave and I have dropped the link so that you can later go back and view this again. If you're a journalist and are trying to remember what was said, or if you have a friend who couldn't make it and you think they would want to watch this, please feel free to share it. That's why we do that. Next